I did not confront my son when I heard him call me a burden. I did not cry, I did not argue, and I did not give him the chance to explain. Instead, I stayed silent, sold my $750,000 home, and disappeared before he even realized what I knew. By the time he came back, everything was gone, and so was the life he thought he could take from me. What he did not understand was this was never about the house. It was about something far more dangerous. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I am 71 years old. I live alone in a quiet corner of Asheville, North Carolina, in a house that still feels like it belongs to two people instead of one. It sits on Maple Ridge, where the trees lean gently toward the mountains and the mornings arrive slow and golden. The house is worth more than I ever imagined it would be, somewhere around $750,000 now. But to me, its value has never been measured in money. It was built from years of saving, from my husband Thomas's steady hands, and from a life that once felt full in every room. Thomas and I bought this land when Ethan was just a boy. There was nothing here but uneven dirt and a line of trees that did not yet know they would become our backyard. He built the workshop behind the house himself, plank by plank, turning it into a place where he shaped wood into something lasting. Even now, I still rent that space to a local craftsman, not because I need the money, but because I cannot bear to see it sit empty. It keeps the echo of Thomas's life alive. My days are simple, and I have grown to appreciate that simplicity. I wake early, make my coffee, and sit on the porch watching the fog lift from the hills. I tend to my small herb garden, drive into town when I need groceries, and meet friends for lunch once a week. I manage my own bills, keep track of my accounts, and still read every line before I sign anything. I'm not confused, not fragile, and certainly not incapable. There is a quiet pride in knowing I have held my life together after losing the man who used to hold it with me. My son Ethan visits more often these days. He is 45 now, a man with his own worries, though I still see traces of the boy he used to be in the way he stands on my porch before knocking. He runs a construction company that has not been doing well, though he does not say that directly. I hear it in the pauses between his sentences, in the way he studies the house when he thinks I am not looking. He used to come by just to talk, to share a meal or fix something small. Lately, his visits feel heavier, like he carries something he cannot quite set down. His wife, Claire, comes with him most of the time. She is always well dressed, always composed, and always smiling in a way that never quite reaches her eyes. She worked in real estate before stepping back, and she has a way of speaking about houses that makes them sound less like homes and more like numbers waiting to be moved around. She walks through my living room slowly, her fingers brushing along the furniture as if she is already imagining it somewhere else. At first, their comments sounded harmless. Claire would stand in the kitchen and say the house was too large for one person. Ethan would mention the stairs and how they might become difficult someday. They talked about simplifying life, about planning ahead, about making things easier. Easier was the word they used most often. I nodded, smiled, and told myself they were only concerned. But the conversations kept circling back to the same place. The house, the value, the future. Each visit felt less like a family gathering and more like a discussion I had not agreed to join. I began to notice how often Claire mentioned retirement communities with carefully landscaped gardens, How often Ethan brought up finances in a tone that felt rehearsed. I did not argue. I have spent most of my life choosing peace over confrontation. It seemed easier to let their words pass, to believe that love was still at the center of it all. Yet something quiet and persistent began to settle in my chest, a feeling I could not name but could not ignore. One evening, after they left, I stood alone in the living room and looked around at the walls that had held my entire adult life. For the first time, I wondered not what they were saying, but why they were saying it so often. And a single question, soft but steady, began to take shape in my mind. When did care start sounding like calculation? If you're still watching and this moment made you feel something shift, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what happened next. The afternoon it happened was as ordinary as any other. I was upstairs folding laundry, pairing socks that had survived too many washes, and smoothing out shirts that no longer held their original shape. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet I had grown used to, where every small sound seemed louder simply because there was no one else there to make noise. When I came back down, I noticed my phone resting on the kitchen counter, the screen dim but holding a small notification. Ethan had called. I did not think much of it at first. He often called for simple things, to check in or to remind me about something I had not asked to be reminded about. I poured myself a cup of tea before tapping the screen and seeing that he had left a voicemail. I pressed play without hesitation, expecting nothing more than an ordinary message. At first, there was only movement. A car door shutting, the faint rustle of fabric, the hollow echo of space that told me he was outside somewhere. Then I heard Claire laugh. It was not the polite laugh she used in my kitchen, not the one softened for company. This one was sharper, unguarded, almost careless. It made me pause without knowing why. Then Ethan spoke. "I know," he said, his voice clear in a way that made it feel like he was standing beside me. "But once we handle it, everything gets easier." There was a pause, followed by Claire's voice, lower but firm enough to carry meaning I could not quite make out. And then Ethan said the words that seemed to split something open inside me. "She's a burden." He did not sound angry. That was the part that stayed with me the most. There was no frustration in his tone, no raised voice, no heat. He said it the way someone might state a fact they had accepted a long time ago. I sat down without realizing I was moving. The chair caught me before my knees gave out completely. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood, that perhaps the signal had cut, or the words had been meant differently, placed in a context I could not hear. But then Claire spoke again, her voice smooth, practical. "Once we get control of the house, it will fix everything." The message ended soon after, just silence, as if nothing important had been said at all. I stared at the phone in my hand, waiting for it to explain itself. The kitchen around me felt unfamiliar, like I had stepped into someone else's home without noticing. The light through the window looked the same, the table stood where it always had, but something fundamental had shifted in a way I could not undo. I pressed play again. The same sounds, the same laughter, the same calm, careless words. "She's a burden." By the third time, there was no room left for doubt. I had heard correctly. Every word had been real, spoken freely because he believed I was not listening. My chest tightened, not with anger, not yet, but with something heavier. Grief came first, a deep, aching grief that settled behind my ribs and spread slowly outward. I thought of Ethan as a boy, running through the yard behind this house, his hands dirty from playing in the soil Thomas had turned for him. I thought of the nights I stayed up when he was sick, the years Thomas and I worked to make sure he had more than we ever did. I thought of the day we buried my husband, and how Ethan had stood beside me, promising we would take care of each other. And now I had heard the truth in his own voice. I was not his mother in that moment. I was a problem he needed to solve. I set the phone down carefully, as if it might break under the weight of what it carried. For a long time, I did not move. The house held its silence around me, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt watchful. That evening, I did not call him back. I did not confront him, did not ask for an explanation I was no longer sure I wanted to hear. Instead, I moved through the house slowly, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the table, the frame of a photograph. Each object felt like proof of a life I had believed in. By nightfall, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. This had not been a moment of anger or a careless mistake. It had been a glimpse into something that had already taken root. I went to bed, but did not sleep. The words repeated in my mind, steady and unchanging. She's a burden. By morning, the grief had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It felt sharper, more defined, as if it had settled into something I could hold instead of something that overwhelmed me. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold in front of me. For years, I had asked myself how to keep peace, how to make things easier for the people I loved. That morning, for the first time, I asked a different question. What is fair? If you're still here and starting to sense something isn't right, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now let's move deeper into the story. The morning after the call, the house felt different, though nothing in it had changed. The same light came through the kitchen window, the same clock ticked steadily above the doorway, and the same chair held me as I sat with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. But something inside me had shifted into place, something quiet and firm that I had not felt in years. I had listened to the voicemail again before the sun came up, not because I doubted what I heard, but because I needed to accept it fully. Each time the words landed with less shock and more clarity. By the 4th time, there was no room left for grief to blur the edges. What remained was understanding. I did not call Ethan back. For most of my life, I would have. I would have asked for an explanation, searched for a softer meaning, given him a chance to reshape the truth into something I could live with. But that morning, I realized something simple and difficult. The truth had already been spoken when he believed I was not listening. Anything said after that would only be a version designed for me. Instead, I stood up and walked to the small cabinet where Thomas used to keep our most important papers. I had not opened it in months. The handle felt cool under my fingers, and for a brief moment, I hesitated. Then I pulled it open. Inside were the pieces of my life reduced to paper. The deed to the house, neatly folded. Bank statements organized in dated envelopes. Insurance documents, identification copies, account numbers written in Thomas's careful handwriting. I placed them one by one on the table, aligning them into neat stacks. My hands did not shake. That surprised me. I had expected emotion to rise again, to slow me down or make me question what I was doing. But there was a steadiness in me now, something that felt less like strength and more like certainty. I was no longer trying to hold everything together. I was deciding what would remain mine. By 10 o'clock, I had made my first call. The attorney's office was one I had used years ago when Thomas updated his will. The receptionist recognized my name and found me an appointment that same afternoon. I did not explain much over the phone. Some things are better said in a room where they can be seen clearly. The drive into town felt longer than usual. Every familiar landmark seemed slightly out of place, as if I were seeing it from a distance instead of living within it. When I sat across from the attorney, I told him what I had heard. I described the pressure, the repeated conversations about the house, and the quiet shift in my son's behavior. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the facts as they were. He listened carefully, then leaned forward with a seriousness that confirmed what I had already begun to understand. He explained that situations like mine could change quickly if I were not careful. If I signed the wrong document or allowed someone else to take control under the pretense of helping, I could lose more than I intended. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to be placed in a position of weakness. I nodded once. That was enough. From his office, I made a second call, this time to a real estate agent recommended by a friend, someone known for handling quiet sales. I did not want a sign in my yard. I did not want neighbors asking questions. I wanted the process to move quickly and without attention. By the time I returned home, the day had already begun to reshape itself around my decisions. I walked through each room slowly, not as someone passing time, but as someone taking inventory of a life that was about to change. The living room still held the outline of every holiday we had spent there. The kitchen carried the memory of countless meals. The hallway still echoed with footsteps that no longer belonged to anyone but me. I paused in the doorway of Ethan's old room, looking at the space that once held his entire world. There was a pull in my chest, a quiet ache that reminded me what I was letting go of, but it did not stop me. This was no longer about holding on. It was about choosing what could not be taken. As the evening settled in, I stood in the center of the house and looked around one last time, not with hesitation, but with clarity. The decision had already been made. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something unexpected: control. If you're still watching and wondering how far this situation will go, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now let's continue to the turning point. The next morning began earlier than usual. I was already dressed and waiting when the real estate agent arrived. Her name was Linda Carver, a woman in her late 50s with a calm presence and eyes that seemed to notice more than she said. She stepped into the house quietly, as if she understood this was not a typical sale. I led her through each room, speaking in practical terms, while something softer moved beneath my words. I told her about the size of the property, the condition of the roof, the age of the heating system. I did not tell her how many birthdays had been celebrated in the dining room or how many quiet evenings Thomas and I had spent on the porch watching the light fade over the mountains. Those things had no place in contracts. Linda listened, took notes, and asked only what was necessary. When we reached the back of the house, she paused at the workshop and glanced at me. I explained that it was rented, that it could be included or separated depending on the buyer's needs. She nodded, already calculating possibilities. Inside again, she laid out my options clearly. A traditional listing would bring a higher price, but it would take time and attention. An off-market sale would move faster, quieter, but likely at a slightly lower value. I did not need to think long. Speed mattered more than pride. By noon, she had made a few calls. By the afternoon, there was interest. A retired couple from outside the city, she said, looking for a place near their grandchildren. They could move quickly. They were serious. That was enough. I contacted my attorney again that same day. He reviewed the preliminary documents, confirmed that everything was in order, and added language to ensure that my decisions were clearly my own. There would be no room for anyone to question my state of mind or my intent. Every step would be documented, protected, and final. After that, I went to the bank. Opening a new account felt like crossing an invisible line. I transferred my funds carefully, moving everything into a place only I controlled. I reviewed every detail, every access point, making sure nothing remained connected to the past. It was not anger that guided me. It was clarity. The movers arrived the following morning. 4 men, efficient and polite, carrying rolls of tape and heavy blankets. They asked simple questions about what would be packed, what would be stored, and what would be left behind. I answered in steady tones, though each decision carried weight. I stood in the bedroom longer than I expected, holding one of Thomas's old jackets. The fabric still carried a faint memory of him, something time had not fully taken. I folded it carefully and placed it in the box marked for the new place. Room by room, the house began to empty. The walls looked wider without the furniture. The floors echoed with footsteps that no longer softened against rugs. The kitchen, once full of small, familiar sounds, fell silent. It was not sudden. It happened slowly enough for me to feel each layer of my life being lifted away. By the second day, there was very little left. I packed only what I needed to take with me. The rest would go into storage or remain with the house. The past could not come entirely forward. Some of it had to stay behind. That evening, I sat at the kitchen counter one last time and wrote a note. The words came without hesitation. I did not allow anger to shape them. I kept them simple, clear, and true. There was no need for anything more. The next morning, I placed the envelope where it could not be missed. Then I walked out. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the house that had held my entire adult life. The mountains were still there, steady and unchanged. The air carried the same quiet it always had. I locked the door and slipped the key into my bag. This time, when it closed behind me, I knew I would not be coming back. If you're still here and feeling the tension building, comment number 4 below so I know you're locked in. Now, let's see how everything begins to change. The cabin by the lake was quiet in a way that felt almost unreal. The water stretched out in front of me, still and reflective, catching the early light like nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. Birds moved across the surface without urgency. The trees stood steady. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, I felt like I was waiting. I knew the exact time Ethan and Claire's flight would land. I knew how long it would take them to collect their bags, to drive back through familiar roads, to turn onto Maple Ridge and pull into the driveway they believed was still theirs to enter. I tried not to picture it, but the image came anyway. Ethan stepping out of the car, keys in hand, Claire beside him, already speaking before the door was even opened. Except the door would not open. My phone began ringing just before noon. Ethan's name filled the screen again and again, each call closer together than the last. I let it ring. I placed the phone face down on the table, but the vibration carried through the wood, steady and insistent. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than the noise. Then the messages began. The first ones were short, confused. He asked where I was, why the house was empty, what was going on. A few minutes later, the tone shifted. The questions sharpened, stretched into demands. He said I needed to call him immediately, that something was wrong, that this was not acceptable. Claire's messages followed, more measured, but no less pointed. She suggested there had been a misunderstanding, that I might have made decisions under stress. She used careful language, the kind that sounded reasonable on the surface while pushing responsibility back toward me. I read every word. I did not answer. There was a moment when my hand hovered over the screen, when the instinct to respond rose without permission. He was still my son. That part of me had not disappeared, but I set the phone down again and stepped outside instead. The air was cool, the kind that settles gently against your skin without asking anything from you. I stood at the edge of the water and reminded myself of what I had heard, of what I now understood. This was not confusion, it was consequence. By early afternoon, the calls slowed, replaced by something else. Linda, the real estate agent, contacted me with a tightness in her voice that told me everything before she said it. Ethan had come to her office. He had demanded information, questioned the sale, insisted something was wrong. He suggested I had not been thinking clearly. He implied the transaction could not be valid. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that settle. It was not surprise I felt. It was confirmation. The same story he had been preparing quietly had now been brought into the open. Not concern, not care. Strategy. Not long after, another message came through. This one was different. It was a photo. Ethan stood in front of a storage facility across town, the building unmistakable. My furniture, my boxes, the pieces of my life that had been moved out of the house now sat somewhere behind those metal doors. The message beneath it was brief, but it carried more weight than anything before. He wrote that I could not hide what belonged to him. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Something cold moved through me then, not fear exactly, but a recognition that the line had shifted. This was no longer about hurt feelings or misunderstandings. It had become something else entirely. My hands trembled, but my mind did not. I took a screenshot and sent it to my attorney. Then I set the phone down carefully, as if the act itself required precision. The lake remained still outside, unchanged, indifferent to everything unfolding beyond its surface. But inside me, something had settled into place. This was no longer a private family matter. This was a fight. I did not sleep much that night. The cabin was still, the kind of stillness that usually settles the mind, but not this time. Every small sound seemed sharper, every passing minute louder than it should have been. Ethan's message stayed with me, repeating itself in a quiet, relentless way. You cannot hide what belongs to me. I sat at the small wooden table near the window and looked out at the dark surface of the lake. There was no movement, no reflection of anything but the faint outline of trees. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of something I could not yet see clearly. I called my attorney first thing in the morning. I explained everything, the message, the photo, the tone that had shifted from confusion to something colder. He listened without interrupting, then told me to forward every message, every image, every detail. He said it mattered now, not just as a record, but as protection. There was a pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that made me sit straighter. He told me he had found something. Documents connected to a private loan. Not a traditional bank, not something regulated in the way I understood. A series of agreements built on projected assets. My house was listed in those projections, not directly, but clearly enough. The language suggested future liquidity tied to a family property transition. I closed my eyes as he explained it. Ethan had not just hoped for my house. He had already used it. The realization settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place. This had never been about timing or convenience. It had been part of a larger plan, one that had moved forward without my knowledge or consent. I felt the shock first, sharp and immediate. Then came something deeper. I had been reduced to a number on a page. My attorney warned me carefully. If I made any statement suggesting I would help, even something informal, it could be used against me. It could tie me to obligations I had never agreed to. The safest path was distance, complete and unwavering. After the call, I sat in silence for a long time. Memories came without invitation. Ethan as a boy, asking for help with things he could not yet do on his own. Ethan as a young man, calling when life did not go as planned. Each time I had stepped in without hesitation. That is what mothers do. We close the gap when the world opens beneath our children. But this was different. This gap had been built with intention. My phone buzzed again, this time with a number I did not recognize. I let it ring. A few seconds later, a message appeared. The words were polite, but there was something beneath them, something that felt like pressure wrapped in courtesy. It suggested urgency, implied consequences, and asked me to respond quickly. I did not. Another message followed, slightly more direct, referencing financial matters that needed immediate clarification. It did not mention Ethan by name, but it did not need to. The meaning was clear enough. I forwarded both messages to my attorney. By then, the shape of the situation had fully revealed itself. This was no longer contained within my family. Other people were involved, people who had expectations, who had been given information that was never theirs to have. I stood and walked to the window again, looking out at the lake that remained unchanged by everything unfolding around it. There is a moment when a choice becomes unavoidable, not because it is easy, but because every other option would cost too much. I could help. I could step in, write something, offer something, try to fix what had been set in motion. Or I could protect what was left of my life. The answer came without hesitation, though it did not come without pain. I would not help. Not this time. I sat back down, folded my hands in front of me, and let the weight of that decision settle. It was not anger that held it in place. It was clarity. And I knew as I looked out at the still water that whatever came next would unfold without me stepping in to soften it. Some consequences have to be faced, even when they belong to your own child. If you're still watching and realize this just got far more serious than expected, comment number 6 below to let me know you're ready. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. A few days passed, though time no longer felt measured in hours. It moved differently now, marked not by routine but by updates. I stayed in the cabin, keeping my world small and quiet, while everything beyond it began to unravel. The first call came from my attorney late in the morning. His voice carried the same steady tone, but the information he delivered was anything but steady. Ethan's situation had worsened quickly. Payments had been missed. Projects tied to his construction business were beginning to stall. The kind of delay that does not fix itself once it starts. I listened without interrupting. He explained that pressure was building from multiple directions. The people involved were not willing to wait, not willing to accept uncertainty. Deadlines that once seemed flexible had become fixed. There was talk of legal action if things did not move soon. When the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving. It was no longer a possibility. It was happening. Later that afternoon, I received a message from someone I had known for years, a woman who had once attended church with me. She did not say much, only that she had seen Ethan earlier that week. She said he looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him, that he had lost weight, that something was clearly wrong. I read the message twice before setting the phone down. In my mind, I could still see him as he had been not long ago, standing in my kitchen, speaking about plans and future opportunities as if everything were within reach. That version of him had carried confidence, even when something beneath it felt uncertain. Now that confidence was gone. Another update came the next day. This time, it included Claire. She had not stepped away from the situation. If anything, she had been part of its momentum from the beginning. Decisions had been made together. Promises had been shaped by both of them. But now, there were signs of strain, tension between them, arguments, blame beginning to surface where certainty had once been. I closed my eyes and let that settle. There was a time when I would have stepped in without hesitation. I would have called, asked what was wrong, offered whatever I could to make things easier. That instinct had not disappeared. It rose in me now, quiet but persistent. But I did not act on it. Instead, I walked outside and stood near the edge of the lake. The water moved gently, small ripples spreading outward before fading into stillness again. The air was cooler than it had been the day before, carrying the kind of calm that follows after something has already passed through. This was the part no one talks about, not the moment of impact, but what comes after. The silence, the weight, the realization that there is nothing left to hold back what has already begun. I knew then that what I had feared was no longer ahead of us. It was here, and it was no longer mine to stop. The request for a meeting came through my attorney 2 days later. Ethan wanted to see me, not at the cabin, not anywhere private, but in a controlled space where everything would be clear and documented. I agreed without hesitation, not because I expected anything to be repaired, but because I needed to hear what he would say when there was nowhere left to hide. The office was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that carries weight instead of comfort. I sat down across the table and waited. When Ethan walked in, I almost did not recognize him. He looked older, not in years, but in the way a person looks after something has been taken out of them piece by piece. His shoulders were lower, his movement slower, and whatever confidence he once carried had been replaced with something unsteady. Claire followed behind him, her posture still straight, but the sharp control she once held was no longer as smooth. No one spoke at first. Ethan sat down across from me, his hands resting on the table as if he needed something solid to hold him in place. When he finally began, his voice was quiet but not steady. He talked about pressure, about business struggles that had grown beyond what he expected, about decisions that seemed manageable at first, but became harder to control. He spoke in pieces, circling the truth without stepping directly into it. I listened. There was a time when I would have helped him find the right words, soften the space between what he meant and what he could not say. But I did not do that now. My attorney placed a set of documents on the table between us. The shift was immediate. Ethan looked down at them, and whatever distance he had been trying to keep disappeared. The truth was no longer something he could shape. It was already there, written in clear language that did not bend. He admitted then what had been building all along. They had counted on the house, not as a possibility, but as something certain. They had built their plans around it, spoken about it as if it already belonged to them. I felt something settle inside me, not new, but confirmed. Claire spoke next, her voice tight, explaining it as planning, as moving things forward before they became complicated. She used careful words, but the meaning did not change. I looked at them both, steady and calm. There is a difference between helping someone and taking control of them. What you were doing was not help. Ethan lowered his head, the space between us filled with something heavier than anger. He said he was sorry, that he knew it had gone too far, that he had believed he could fix everything before it reached this point. I believed that he was sorry, but I also knew something else. Sorry does not change what you are willing to do. I told him that I would not help, not financially, not legally, not in any way that would tie me to what he had created. The consequences were his now. When the meeting ended, I stood and walked out without looking back. The truth had been spoken, and nothing about it could be undone. If you're still here and feel like the truth is about to come out completely, comment number 8 below so we can finish this together. Now, let's move to the final outcome. Time moved forward whether I followed it closely or not. In the weeks after the meeting, everything settled into something quieter, though not lighter. The sharp edge of what had happened did not disappear, but it no longer cut the same way. It became something I carried instead of something that carried me. I no longer stayed at the cabin. I found a smaller home not far from the lake, a single-level house with pale blue shutters and a narrow porch that faced the trees. It did not have the history of the house on Maple Ridge, but it did not need to. It felt steady, and that was enough. I chose it because it was simple, because it asked nothing from me except to live in it. My days became my own again. I planted herbs along the edge of the porch, arranged the few pieces of furniture I had brought with me, and placed Thomas's chair by the window where the light came in during the afternoon. I kept only what mattered. The rest belonged to a life that had already closed. I heard about Ethan through others at first. His business had failed. Projects had stopped, and debts had followed quickly behind. The kind of collapse that does not leave room for denial. There were rumors of legal trouble, of payments that could not be met. Claire was no longer beside him in the way she once had been. Whether she had stepped away or simply moved her distance, I did not ask. I felt no satisfaction in any of it, only a quiet understanding that this was the path he had chosen, even if he had not meant to walk it this far. Weeks later, a letter arrived. Not a message, not a quick attempt to explain, but a letter written in careful, uneven lines. He did not ask for money. He did not offer excuses. He spoke about what he had done, about what he had allowed himself to become, and about the weight of it now. I read it once, then set it aside. Love does not disappear. That is the part no one prepares you for. It remains, even when trust is broken. But something else had changed. I was no longer the woman who would give everything to keep peace. I sat on my porch that evening, watching the light fade through the trees, and understood something clearly. I had not won anything, but I had kept myself. By the time autumn settled in, my new home no longer felt temporary. It felt like something I had chosen, not something I had been pushed into. The mornings were quiet, the kind of quiet that did not carry tension anymore. I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the light move through the trees, steady and unhurried. I thought often about the woman I used to be, the one who believed love meant saying yes, even when something felt wrong, the one who chose silence because it seemed easier than conflict. I do not regret loving that way, but I understand now what it cost. Ethan came to see me one afternoon. He stood on the porch for a moment before knocking, holding a small paper bag in his hands. When I opened the door, I saw the change in him immediately, not just in how he looked, but in how he carried himself. There was no expectation in his eyes anymore. He handed me the bag. Inside were a few small plants. We did not say much. Some things do not need many words. As he left, I stood on the porch and watched him walk away, not with fear, not with anger, but with something steadier. I am not the woman I was, and for the first time in a long time, I am at peace. Some endings do not arrive with noise or closure, but with a quiet understanding that something within has shifted for good. There comes a moment in life when you realize that love, no matter how deep, cannot survive without respect, and that kindness without boundaries slowly turns into self-abandonment. True strength is not found in enduring everything in silence, but in knowing when to step back and protect what remains of your own peace. Not every broken bond needs to be restored, and not every apology needs to be accepted in the same way it was once expected. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is choosing yourself without bitterness, without anger, and without the need to prove anything to anyone. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Your voice matters more than you think. And if you believe in stories that remind us of our worth, do not forget to follow and subscribe for more.